Good morning, everyone, and welcome once again to the Friday JKMRC Friday seminar series. We acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians on the land on which we meet today. On behalf of SMI, we pay our respect to the ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australia and the global society. We are quite grateful today to have Geoff Deans with us. Geoff is going to talk about complex and complicated, how modifying factors can impact resources development. A little bit about Geoff. So Geoff is the founder and director of Modifying Factors, a firm based in Adelaide in South Australia. He has over 2 decades of experience in complex project management environment and delivering significant projects such as the Karapitina sub-level cave development and block cave expansion. His expertise spans multi-factor risk management, focusing on integrating technical, economic, regulatory, and community considerations to enhance project outcomes. Geoff holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master's degree from UQSMI. He's a fellow of OSIM and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. With a warm welcome, kindly welcome, Geoff.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you very much, UQ, for the opportunity to be back here. I was actually a master's student here about a decade ago, so it's fantastic to have the opportunity to come back and talk to you about modifying factors and how they're impacting resource developments. So, do this, Eric. There we go. All right. So, a bit of an overview of the presentation for today. Unabashedly, this is a big picture presentation. This is a framing conversation to support understanding the situation. So everyone's jobs come together to deliver resource projects. They take a long time. There's lots of phases. There's lots of interdependencies. There's lots of interactions. So understanding the entire situation is really important to framing and making sense of where you fit in. So part of it, keeping it as simple as we can, why I'm here, where we are now, what are modifying factors, okay? It's all in the name, but there's a bit more to it. How they can influence resource developments. So how is a big word, but also can. They don't always, and that's a really important piece because every project and every context is unique, but how these modifying factors can influence a project changes over time. It's context specific, project specific. And this is where the complexity comes in, is that a lot of these things are dynamic. And then the 3 key points that are part of this, because it is topical, is around how you can include this in risk and impact assessments. Okay, so that's a large part of everyone's core business. It doesn't matter what function you're in a resources project. Risk is the language of resource development. So understanding how impacts can occur and what the outbound or inbound risk are. ESG, very topical. ESG considerations have been part of modifying factors as part of disclosures for a very long time. Here to debunk a bit of that and give you a bit more context. And then finally around project viability and reporting. So actually putting this into practice, making sense of these things so that impacts can be prevented and projects can go forward. And the last one is what seems to be coming over the horizon, which is what's next. And we'll talk about that in final thoughts. So again, we'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet. It's great to be here in Queensland. And thank you very much. And again, touching base on modifying factors, how they can influence project developments. These are the 3 lumpy core parts to this. So I'll be talking about these in general terms because they all overlap and interact with each other. That's, how you do risk assessment, how you consider ESG factors is going to influence and impact project viability reporting. So they happen sequentially, but also they happen concurrently. So, oh, thank you. Here we go. All good? Thank you. All right. So let's do a bit of the framing. What are modifying factors? Okay, it's all in the name. A modifying factor in the most general large term is a factor, a variable or an element that alters or influences the outcome or behavior of something else. Okay, so when things interact, that can be technical inputs, they can be social inputs, they can be regulatory inputs, they can be economic inputs. So if you change a corporate economic assumption for your cutoff grade, that changes your oil reserve statement. If a government changes a law or regulation, that can change how your project operates. Okay. If your project interacts with another company or another stakeholder, that can change it. Okay. So, and the concept of a modifying factor is not new. They've been around for a long time. In literature, medicine talks about modifying factors. So if you've got an underlying health condition and doctor's going to prescribe you a medication, that'll be a modifying factor, because if those two medications interact and make you sicker, that's a problem. Okay, that overall makes a worse outcome. And that's the challenge with this. It's also in agriculture. Okay, modifying factor in agriculture. Does it rain or not? How much rain? What's the soil type? What's the fertilizer that you put in here? How those factors change and how they interact, and some of them you can control, some of them you can't, influence the outcome and the performance. So again, they're unique to every sector, but not necessarily special. And what we'll be talking about today is the role that they play in the resources sector. So under the CRISCO global disclosure standards, which represent 81% of global disclosure requirements for the mineral sector, modifying factors is embedded in there. The JORC code, which is the Australian code, disclosure code, reflects and requires the consideration for modifying factors to define reasonable prospects for economic extraction. So that's a fancy way of saying, well, you've got a resource in the ground, but depending on how you're going to mine it and where it is, how much of that resource can actually be converted into a mineable reserve. Okay, so if you've got a project that has a really good ore body, but happens to sit under, and I come from Adelaide, under the Adelaide Oval, for example, your prospects, your reasonable prospects, that you need to disclose that. So it's not saying it's good or bad. It's not saying you can or you can't. It's just saying you need to disclose that, because that's a potentially modifying factor. So that sits within the JORC code. It also sits within the VALMIN code, which is the resource valuation code. JORC codes are currently under review at the moment, so I won't be talking about that in any detail because I'm not part of that process, but the 2012 version has these factors in there. They're part of CRISCO and they're part of VALMIN. So with all of that though, all these factors exist and they're all important, but what really matters is the materiality of the impact. Okay, so impacts happen, but does it actually matter in the context of your project with what's going on? And that sounds simple, but it's actually, that's where a lot of the complexity comes in, because materiality of impact comes down to time, and it comes down to who's evaluating that materiality. So something that's fine for me might not be acceptable for somebody else or a regulator. And that's where some of the complexity comes in. Bit of my background, because people like pictures and stories to understand these things. So, and this will all make sense when the next slides come through. I've spent 20 plus years living and working in remote contexts. So lived in the US, Canada, South Korea, lived in Aboriginal communities for about 5 years, and then have worked in the mining sector, in and around the mining sector for about the last 15 years. So part of it, and done projects in Australia, in Brazil, so different contexts, and understanding how to operationalize and develop those projects in those contexts. So had the opportunity, I worked for a company called Oz Minerals, which was based in South Australia. Fantastic company, worked with fantastic teams on fantastic projects that actually got built, which was great. So it was part of the Carrapateena sublevel block cave, sublevel cave development, all the ancillary infrastructure there, the 270-kilometre power transmission line projects, demobilisation of open pits, exploration projects, bringing in projects in different countries into the business and doing that integration. And then my last role was as the project director for the block cave expansion there. So it was kind of a full circle, which was great. So here it kind of is on a page. The purpose of this isn't actually to say, you know, these are all the things. It's to say things change. There's a big life cycle of projects and you do different things. And a lot of the roles that I ended up doing in the resources sector didn't exist when I started in the sector. And that's the complexity of the space. Things move on, things evolve, and you're working at different levels of the business, doing different pieces of work and trying to make sense of how everything fits together is a real challenge, because you can do your work the right way at the right time to your budget, but it may modify someone else's work or create an unexpected or unintended impact somewhere else that creates problems elsewhere. And that, being part of teams and working within teams inside your business and then understanding how that interacts with the outside of the business is really complex, because things inside change and things outside change. But there's no way around that. That's just the reality of where it is. And the challenge is if you look at the bottom here, the project phases are common to all projects, but they take such a long period of time, and people specialize in different areas, or they aren't there for the journey. It's very rare for people to be on a project from start to finish. And that's, you know, the beauty of the work that's done here at SMI, that it brings all that collective knowledge from different jurisdictions and different phases and different disciplines together. So you get to learn from what everyone else has done and apply it to your context, which is really important. And, you know, probably the thing that I've learned in my key learnings of all of this is that everything I've done and every project kind of follows this cycle. You come into something and you're like, oh, this is pretty straightforward. I've got this, you know, and then afterwards you're like, oh, actually, there's probably a bit more to this. So this is the psychological biases that most people have around things. It's not a bad thing. It's just being aware of it. And that's where the challenge is around, you know, building teams and managing, working in projects to de-risk the outcomes, is understanding what you don't know and being able to work with people and organisations to do those things, because there's always something more to learn. And part of the reason is things change. You know, what was true today won't be necessarily true tomorrow. And especially when you're looking at a 16 or 17 year mining development life cycle, you know, you look at iPhones came around in 2007, Facebook, I don't know when that came out, but, you know, the world, AI has only been around, you know, the world is changing very, very quickly, and making sense of that's really important. So, and we'll get into the nitty gritty bits in a bit, but I suppose part of it is in any decision-making process, understanding what your blind spots are and where information sits is really, really important. And so I don't know if people have come across this before, but, you know, there's kind of 4 stages of knowing. There's, you know what you know, so they're the facts, they're fixed. A lot of technical knowledge is facts. You know, if you put things together, they're going to behave in a certain way. So you can have a high level of confidence. You know what you don't know, but you can manage those things in a bounded, controlled environment, which is really important. That's how you do experiments and iterate and learn those things. If you don't know what you don't know, that's a problem, because you've got an unbounded risk. And that's where a lot of the complexity comes into this, is that it's not that people are doing the wrong things at the wrong time. It's just that things come out of left field, right? That's where complexity is. And then the one that's really challenging, especially in complex and managing these modifying factors, is that what people know for sure that isn't true. Now, there should be a little asterisk next to that, which is basically saying it was true when you did it and you put it in the model and you measured it and you did the impact assessment, but then it isn't true anymore. And it's not because you've done anything wrong. It's because things have changed. The weather changes, laws change, environmental factors change. All of these things happen, and how you consider those impacts in your risk work is really, really important. And again, the countervailing trends for development, and these are reflected in papers that long-time collaborator Bruce Harvey and I that are available online around providing more context on this, is that everything's getting more complex because there's more things that are interacting at a higher frequency. People are less inclined to accept the risk of what's going on, and stakeholders' expectations are increasing. That's the world we live in, by and large. So just be aware of that. And again, going to, what does that look like when we're talking about performance? And this goes back to the journey of my working career, is, starting and working in the late 2000s in the sector. Everyone did their own job, but it wasn't necessarily put together. You did community relations. That's how I ended up here at UQ doing the study, because I'm like, well, what is this? Who can I learn from? How does this work? Because there's got to be a system, and all of these disciplines are a system. They do have a language. They do have a way of making decisions. What's happening now is that as things become more layered and interact with each other, those systems are becoming more interconnected and interdependent. And that's where I was talking before the presentation around water and land. If you look at the performance requirements for production, technical requirements, financial, social, environmental, governance, a lot of those factors are common to all of those things. So understanding that multi-factor risk is that you've got all these different work packages that align, that need these same resources or have these things, is really important, because that's where the world's going at the moment. And this is derived from some of the work that's done here at University of Queensland around complex ore bodies. So again, trying to simplify something that's not simple is really saying that, if you're talking about resource developments, the simple safe projects, the ones that are low sensitive areas, high grade, shallow, safe jurisdictions, proximity to established infrastructure, they kind of run their race. They're done. People have found them or liberated them. So now we're moving into the complicated or complex quadrants, where you've got complicated projects. So working on a block cave, lower grade, depth, temperature, larger environmental footprints, especially when we talk about lower grade, that often translates to more tailings, more water, more power, more land, more waste. So that's a challenge. And then you've got complex, which is you've got more likely to be located in remote or environmentally sensitive areas, land connected peoples, and then governance challenges. So that's kind of the two tangents. And then if you go all the way forward, probably when those quadrants are a bit more explored, then you've got projects that align, tick both those boxes concurrently. And then when we're talking about resources, they're either there or they're not. So you have, they're context specific. So understanding how this is going to be worked through over time is really, really important. And there's learnings from other sectors, mega projects, which is a discipline that looks at large scale infrastructure projects. They all have similar characteristics and considerations, but they're all unique. All right. So situation for the resources sector. Again, modifying factors, they're part of disclosures the world over. So they've been there a long time. They're preconditions to be able to make a reserve declaration. So you've got a resource, but actually how much of that is mineable economically? And that's where the impact of modifying factors has long-standing in these disclosure codes. Now, these aren't compliance codes, these are disclosure codes. They're disclosure codes by and large for investors or external stakeholders. So traditionally it's been investors, but now governments, and other interested stakeholders are using these to make sense of the project. What are your reasonable prospects for economic extraction? You know, so that they can make an assessment on what needs to be true and what is true for a project to be able to proceed and go forward. So it's not saying it's good or bad. It's not saying you can or you can't. It's really just saying, tell me about the project. What are the factors that are there? Is it in an arid land or is it in a tropical environment? Because that's going to change your water considerations. You know, do you have land tenure or don't you have land tenure? You know, are you close to existing infrastructure or are you not? What jurisdiction are you in? What, you know, are there clear permitting and legal constructs to work within, or is it a bit more opaque? That's the purpose of these. It's not to say it's not like ESG reporting or external reporting where you're going against external benchmarks. This is really a disclosure. So based on materiality, competence, and transparency, saying this is the project, this is what we believe to be true, and this is how we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to manage the impacts, and then you disclose those things. And that's really important because projects take a long time. And again, there's when you're thinking about impact and risk, you know, consequence in reversibility, thinking about the impacts over a long period of time. So cost of change is quite easy in an early stage of a project, you know, before you've invested a lot of money or you've put things in place. But as you move closer to final investment decisions or into construction, and we're talking about the whole life cycle here, if you put a tailings storage facility in the wrong place once you've constructed it, that's highly consequential and pretty well irreversible. Okay. And this is where understanding risk and impact is that certain decisions and impacts aren't consequential and they are reversible. So going from there, but other things aren't. And understanding those impacts to a project or a stakeholder or a regulator is really, really important because that informs, you know, when should that decision be made with what's going on, because at the early stages of a project, there's a lot of uncertainty and risk. And that's okay because you don't know much. And disclosing that and talking about that's fine, because at the end of the day, you can't know everything. You can't take everything to 99%, 90% to design, but recognizing that as you proceed along a project, if you don't have certain preconditions before you invest capital into designing something, that can be really risky. And that's one of the challenges that, and again, from mega projects, long and fat tails is a term that's used out of that, which is once the contracts are awarded, once you've bought all the kit, once you've got everyone to site, if you have to change the location of where something goes or a design because you don't have a permit or there's an external factor that changes something, that's really expensive. Whereas if you plan slow and get all those preconditions in place, it means you can construct a lot faster and then bring it to operation, do operational readiness and bring it to operations a lot quicker. And so the situation around that is that these modifying factors that are part of this, and they're all listed down the side there, they're common to all resource projects. It's just whether or not they're material at what stage of your project. And the challenge is that as a project, you're managing project-related risks, which is your inside view, which is a lot of the time the complicated work, a lot of technical work, things that are bounded within your control. You get to choose what you do with the ore body. You get to choose how you're going to design a processing plant. You get to choose how you do these things. The situated risks is the complex pieces that goes with it. And the challenge is the inside work is cached within the context that you're in. So, you know, assuming or designing something based on the ability to do have a water source or have a piece of land or have a licensing condition to do something may get changed because of a situational factor. And that's the complexity of understanding those perspectives. So again, understanding this complexity using an analogy. I was talking to some people yesterday around this, is that, you know, the inside view is if you are sailing to a destination, right? So the objective for your project is to get from where you are to the destination where you are or where you need to be. So you've got a budget, you've got a schedule, you've got a timetable, you've got resources, all the things that you can control, you control. So you buy the ship, you stock it up with everything and all the rest of it. But as soon as you leave the shore, there's outside factors that you can't control, but you can be aware of. So the wind, the waves, other people on the water. So that's going to change potentially how you go and deliver your project, because you're going to have to respond to those things. But at the end of the day, what matters is what you're delivering and when. So planning for those things and understanding what could impact your project is really, really important. But you can't predict what is going to happen when. But you can just understand that how you respond to those things. And the challenge around this is that common impacts have multiple and different perspectives of risk. So there's a story around 6 blind men and an elephant. So they don't know, they've got a different view of what it is depending. So where you stand on a matter depends on where you sit. Now, when we're talking about this is a mock-up in terms of land use. Okay, so if you go to anywhere in the world, there's a piece of land, and depending on what your role is in a business or what you're trying to do, you'll look at it through your lens. So for some people, it'll be farmland, it might be a national park, it's going to be cultural heritage values, could be an infrastructure easement, could be a mineral deposit, could be a renewable energy zone, could be an environmental offset. Okay, it could be a range of different things. It could be housing land. So depending on what those orientations are and how many uses there are, that's going to define how many different parties or pieces of legislation that you may impact to be that as part of your project. If you're impacting lots of different pieces of legislation or lots of different stakeholders, that creates a lot of complexity. That's basically the bottom line. The more impacts you have, the more risks that are potentially created and the more complexity you've got. Now, that's just how it is now. And we'll talk about that a bit later on around how many different layers of land use and land tenure there are now in Australia. And that's only adding because the context is changing. So now getting into what we're talking about with risk management, ESG, and disclosures, modifying factors. So in terms of, let's take a water or land or anything, they kind of can impact a project in a kind of 3 different ways, right? So we'll start off with the disclosure factors, right? Because that's kind of where it sits with the JORC code and CRISCO and VALMIN. What is material? If not, why not? So this is what the competent persons now need to make sense of. They need to disclose, yes, here's the ore body, here's the resource, and now here's the reserve. When all things are considered, if not, why not? So these are material, these aren't material, this is how it all fits together, this is what we think we can do. But to be able to make a disclosure, you need to understand what are the inputs or preconditions that are required to deliver your project. So it's a simple diagram. Any machine, you've got inputs and outputs. So can you get the water? Can you get the land? Can you access the ore body? What's the recovery rates going to be? You know, all those sorts of things. What's the ore body knowledge? You know, what are the things that need to be true? So considerations. So the considerations of what's going to move things up and down, and the preconditions are, do you have them? You can't optimize a water solution until you've got water. So those things there. And then the bit in the middle is how will or could it impact that? So it's really making sense of the project is to say, well, we've got this, but we don't have that. We need to disclose it. How will it impact it? So is it going to be material? So again, I worked on projects that were based in arid regions. Water, I'll keep going back to water because it cuts across pretty well all disciplines. Water was a big issue because we're arid land, right? How are we going to get the water? How can we use it effectively? How can we deal with it quality and quantity? Then we had projects in Brazil where the delivery factor for water was completely different. It was all about discharge. We've got too much water. What are we going to do with all this water? So they were the delivery factors. So the performance for the asset was the same modifying factor, which was water. But in that context and to deliver the project, it had a completely different impact to the project. So understanding that, and then that fits in with the disclosure, that making sense of these things. So, and this is the situation, and it's in one of the papers that have gone into the AusIMM. If people are interested in reading about this further, is really, and this is the challenge going forward, is how do you understand what the technically feasible? So what is the ore body? And then you've got obviously your mining method, which is going to mean how much of that can you mine economically. And then you've got these other factors that go with it. So you've got to store the waste. So what's the tailings solution potentially? What's the cost of that? Because that's going to impact your cutoff grade and your NSR. Power solution, what's the cost of power? Is there power there? Is there water? Obviously, there's factors such as water impacts we've touched upon, cultural heritage. So cultural heritage is land access, not land tenure. Native title is land tenure. Land access is, can you actually access the land to be able to put something on? And they interact with each other. Cultural heritage factors will influence potentially where you can put a tailings facility. You know, approvals are definitely going to influence what sort of tailings storage facility or water approvals you get. And they all, do you see how they interact with each other? And this is where the complexity comes in, is that you can have an optimal technical solution based on what is on paper there. But then the practical reality is that most of the time, the modifying factors modify a project or a resource negatively. They eat away at it. Okay, and there's some case studies that are out there, and there was a paper article recently about an iron ore mine in Western Australia talking about a 40% resource downgrade because of these sort of factors. All right. So this is a challenge for the disclosures as well as the delivery pieces with what's going on. But there potentially are, it doesn't all have to be negative. If you've got a project that's adjacent to an existing project or there's other things, it actually hypothetically, I haven't seen a case study of this, but a modifying factors could actually potentially increase the amount of, or reserve with what's going on, because it could reduce the input costs or construction costs. So all that sounds great, but what does it actually look like in the real world? Well, here's a study around complex ore bodies completed in 2019. Team from UQ have done this. People in the room, 40 deposits since 2019. How many have gone to production? Any guesses? Not you, Sarah. You know. I'm looking at you now. What do you pick a number? 15. All right. It's 2. 2 projects since 2019. So this is copper. There's lots of copper. People know there's lots of copper. We need copper. Everyone's telling us we need more. The challenge is that how do you bring these projects online? So again, at the end of the day, all of those factors across the top, grade, water, tailings, mineralogy, permitting, legal, local community, land pressure, poverty, arsenic, biodiversity, infrastructure, they're all modifying factors. Right? They all, you can see they modify every project, but they might not necessarily be material to every single project. So, and this is where this concept of multi-factor risk comes in, is that things layer on top of each other. So if you look at some of these projects, if you've got water issues or infrastructure issues, you probably have local community issues, because local communities respond to impacts. So there's an analogy that's in a underground mining operators conference paper is around, shin kicking. So if I kick somebody in the shin, that's going to elicit a response, okay? When you're taking something away from somebody or impacting something that someone else is using, there will be a response. So, and then the other one is around land as well. I know I keep going back to land and water, but they're easy case studies. Tailings, permitting, land pressures, biodiversity, all these impacts, and they layer on top of each other, and then they interact with each other. So navigating a pathway through is really important with all these things to be able to get a project that is, you have land tenure, land access that's permitted, that aligns with your technical requirements, your commercial requirements, and they all need to conform when you get to a final investment decision for it to go forward. If any of those areas don't conform, it becomes really problematic for that project to go forward. So here's a piece of work that's been done by Paul Milano and the team at S&P Global. Again, when we're thinking about these things, these are life of mine considerations and factors as well. So again, used to be, this was updated recently, so it was 15.5 years to get from first discovery, not exploration activity, first discovery, so you found something, to production. That number's changed. It's now 17.9 years, so things are going in the wrong direction. And the biggest variance, if you look at the bottom part of this graphic, is the discovery, exploration, and studies. And then there's a phase as well after that. So that's 11.3 years. And then there's a waiting time of 2.1 years. So this is the time in which all the studies come in, all the work's done, and you put it together, and then potentially you need to go and get insurance, you've got to get financing, or you've got to see if it reconciles. And of having been somebody that's worked as part of teams that have been bringing all these work packages together to make sure they conform, really hard. It's like hitting a bullseye from 20 meters away, because everyone's doing their own work, but it all needs to come together so that the board, by and large, can make an investment decision because they've got confidence that what they need in place is going to be there. Construction, the construction duration isn't materially changing, but a huge amount of the risk for project development still sits within the construction period, because if any of those preconditions or changes happen during the construction period, that's where the major capital risk of a project sits. And then obviously after that, you've got, so if we're talking about managing modifying factors or disclosing them over the life of a project, well then to get to this point, we still need to consider how long it takes to get to, pre-discovery. So early stage exploration, getting land tenure, land access, doing the work to do that, that's not included in this. So, and we all understand the likelihood of, what the rates are of success there. And then you've got ramp up and then into operations. And again, long tails, the consequences of some of those decisions. Anyone that's worked in operations or other projects have seen the decisions that have been made earlier in the project life cycle that have consequences that are often irreversible and highly consequential. And especially if you're looking to do ramp up or organic growth later on, how certain things are done during the study process means that it's almost like unscrambling an egg. You kind of have to start again. But I suppose a key part to this is we're not alone. Okay, there's huge amount of lessons that are coming out of this from mega projects, which is effectively large scale, complex, typically cost billions, take a long time to build, involve multiple and public and private stakeholders, can be transformational, and mega projects often influence millions of people. So the key message is there, lots of text, but at the end of the day, the biases and the learnings that come out of those, they're not the same, but they provide a lot of opportunity for resources projects. And I'd argue that are really, really important for resources projects, because unlike a road or a factory where you've got a lot more flexibility to move things, a resource is where it is. So you can move some of the ancillary infrastructure and you can optimize some of those design pieces there, but a resource is a resource. So understanding where that is. So I suppose one of the things is planning versus plans. And this is where understanding the role of modifying factors in project design, delivery, and disclosure. It's really talking about your planning, okay? How have you gone about this? What do you believe is true? What isn't true? What needs to be true? What do you know? What don't you know? Because plans change, right? Every time anyone that's worked in projects, you plan and then the first day you turn up and things change. So, but one of the challenges is, again, it's not universal. Again, it's generalist, but what was simple is kind of falling away now, right? Doing that planning to understand the complexity of the context you're in and when things are going to potentially interact will get you to a more right outcome. Okay, uncertainty isn't about removing it. You want to as much as you can, but the reality is that it's about reducing and defining the level of uncertainty. So if I don't know if it's going to, an example is if I go outside, I don't know if it's going to rain today. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, but I'll take a rain jacket and then it doesn't really matter. Like it's not that big a consequence. Whereas if I'm designing a project and I'm spending, $100 million on studies, but I don't have land tenure, land access, or a water solution, that's probably a different scenario of risk with what's going on. So again, some of the consequences, it's the Q in consequences, competent persons evaluations. At the end of the day, these they're competent persons that have to disclose this in the sector, in the resources sector. Their job's becoming very, very difficult because they're responsible for assessing all of this information and making sense of it. And obviously they make sense. They've got teams and teams of people and experts that bring it all together. But doing things independently and in silos is challenging, right? And that's because these are project risks about the project, the budget, the schedule, the outcome, the resource. So when all things are put together, making sense of it. So building the right knowledge of the right information at the right time to give confidence around those disclosures. And again, the disclosures aren't saying you know absolutely everything. It's saying we know what we know what we don't know, and this is material, and this is what we're doing about it, and this isn't material because, again, water example, getting enough water for our project in Brazil wasn't material because it's in Brazil. So we didn't, you can make note of that, but it's an if not, why not piece. So got 5 minutes left before questions. So just finished a piece of work. We've worked with AMEC, so the Australian Mining and Exploration Council, on this emerging domain of a modifying factor, which is other projects. So use the analogy earlier that you've got a ship, a boat, and you're sailing to a destination. What's happening now is the sea's becoming really congested. There's lots of other projects looking to develop concurrently in many common jurisdictions. So land tenures overlapping, stakeholder interests are interacting, local impacts are interacting, water use is interacting, because you've got multiple sectors potentially looking to extract water from the same aquifers, okay? You've got lots of companies looking to use the same roads, the same rail, same power connection agreements, same labour forces, working with the same traditional owner groups. It's becoming a lot more complex because you've got different sectors doing different things. So again, this is part of the work that AMEC will release in due course. But one of the things which is, and again, it was all about land use and land tenure in Australia. But you've got more and more projects that are looking to access land to do something above the ground or below the ground. So 10 years ago, renewables projects and winds projects, so solar wind, they weren't a big thing. Now they're growing, and a lot of the resources demand is coming from the need for the renewable sector to be able to build this infrastructure and install it. And then you've got more populations are growing, more housing, land prices are going up, agricultural, biodiversity, all the things that go with it. And then there's subsurface resources, many of which, may be co-located or they may not be. The challenge is they interact at the surface. So you've got all these different pieces of work that are required. You go to certain parts of Australia, it's not uncommon to see 3 or 4 power lines servicing different companies running concurrently, or rail lines. And then you've got things like ports and laydown facilities and low loaders that all these different sectors are looking to use at the same time. And that layering effect is absolutely a factor that's modifying projects to be able to go forward. Again, this is will be in the report with a lot more information, but should have said this, Australia doesn't have, and again, this is land-based, but it's material to the entire project lifecycle for resources, doesn't have a single integrated system of land use or planning. There's 31 at least that we could identify. So it's probably wrong. This is probably wrong. It's a baseline of what is publicly available. And these land uses and land tenures interact, but they're not always interconnected. And when they overlap, they create direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts to the projects and to the people that are there. So again, as these interact, you've got all these things that layer on top of each other that are happening. This is where the complexity comes in. Again, going back to my lived experience, the team, when we were doing the Carrapateena sublevel cave mine, that was 2015, 2016, we were the only company building anything. So a lot of these considerations and modifying factors, they existed, but they weren't material. We had open slather, basically, in terms of people's time, resources. If you're developing now, that same region has 100 projects with development applications in at the moment. Now, that's a challenge. Not all of those projects will happen. Not all of them will happen at the same time, but they could. And that's where some of this complexity is coming in. So again, just to finish off, why it matters? Well, without projects and frameworks that consider these, you've got them anyway. Okay, the JORC code requires you to consider modifying factors. Again, when we talk about ESG, I haven't spoken about that in great detail, but you can see that anything that impacts a project is a modifying factor. Land, water, disclosures, that's why ESG are in there. No water, no project. No land, no project. No regulatory approvals or governance, you don't have a project. No land tenure, you don't have a project. So these are all preconditions, that's why they're there. There's corporate ESG, which is around things like external indices and all those sort of things. Yes, they matter, but modifying factors, especially with the way the disclosure codes, they're project specific. Okay, they're not enterprise specific. And without them, with why it matters, if people can't understand something, they probably won't invest in it. Insurance is becoming a big part of this as well. Every company needs insurance. If they don't self-insure, they need an insurer. If an insurer can't understand the risk, they probably won't take on the risk. It's a precondition now for development. Governments might block permits or push restrictions mid-project or development life cycle. Again, if you can't adequately manage these things and these impacts, the law will regulate you to do so. That's its job. But by doing this work, which you have to do anyway, you still need to plan, you still need to do all these things. You can attract long-term investors, you can get more buy-in, and then you can future-proof and have credible, insurable, bankable projects. And again, that's touched upon this earlier, but past simple, present, complex and complicated. The future, it's probably going to be a mix of complicated and complex with what's going on. So getting your head around this is really, really important. And again, in closing, how you do risk and manage things is really, really important. That's evolving inside, outside. Environmental and social governance factors, they've always been part of these codes. They're just changing how they impact projects. And it all comes down to project viability and reporting. And they're two sides of the same coin. Okay, how you do a project and how you disclose it are linked. And again, there's all of these things that we can talk to if people want to talk out after: risk management, realistic feasibility, stakeholder confidence. So people need to have confidence. This is where trust comes in. If you disclose it, you can explain it, they'll trust it. They're more likely to trust it. Sustainability and ESG, and then also understanding how to have an adaptive strategy and adaptive capacity in your designs, because things will change and you want the flexibility for them to change. And in practice, you know, how you plan is really, really important with what's going on. And there's more information online. If people want, all this information's derived from some of the papers that we've written and some other things that are coming soon, like the report that I mentioned from AMEC and at the Critical Minerals Conference. And that's it. So if you want any information, get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Hi, Geoff. Thank you for your presentation. Just going back to that slide on the copper project feasibility. It didn't seem to me that risk level alone was a predictor for the project feasibility. I was wondering whether it might be reasonable to quantify the relative importance of each modifying factor and whether this is something that your mission involves to get the full picture.
Great question. I might go. So which slide were you talking about? You're talking about the complex or
40 or so complex ore bodies.
This one here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So really good question. So so in each context, what factor matters when is going to change, right? And I think this is part of it, is that if you've got multiple factors that are uncertain or haven't been resolved that are happening concurrently, they interact and compound off each other. So the opportunity is, depending on what the project is to be able to sequence the work based on the risk. So an example is the team that when we were developing the Carrapateena mine, we needed to develop an infrastructure corridor and we worked with the native title group and landowners, and there was 29 different layers of modifying factors that influence that. Rather than designing the optimal road, we were able to work with everybody to get a corridor that provided the green blobs and red blobs effectively to be able to say, now we can put a road in there. And then that went to the engineering, and it obviously happened with the engineering team to de-risk the pathway for development. So really another way to frame it is having the preconditions met to be able to do something means that you can then cost them. Does that make sense? So understanding how they're separated and when they're going to impact your project is really, really important. Does that answer your question? Or
I can see it's obviously a very complex topic with a lot of interacting factors, so it might be hard to numerically. Okay. Yeah, I can see it's obviously a very complex topic with a lot of interacting factors, so it might be hard to numerically define, the relative importance of each factor. But
yeah, so it depends. That's what makes it complex. Is that yeah, it's difficult, but the work here at the University of Queensland has identified the materiality of those factors. The challenge is when you've got this baseline information like this, then how do you deconstruct it to systematically work through them and reduce some of those interdependencies to be able to get you an outcome.
Thank you.
We got to 53 people online.
Oh, okay.
So there are some 2 questions online. One person wanted to ask, what things can you suggest the industry can do to reduce the years from discovery to production?
So there's a really good, well, again, adopting from mega projects is play and slow, build fast. So, and again, this is lived experience with some of the projects that been involved in, is that if you can de-risk the pathway, then you can optimize the design. So I've touched upon, we worked with some companies because we needed to build a 270-kilometre power transmission line. That went from concept to energisation in 3 years, because all of the factors that were the preconditions to optimise design, we knew what they were, we knew what needed to be true, so we focused on those essential few things versus what was good, and then we could optimise the design. Because so some things, actually, I'll frame it another way, just talking out loud. Some things just take a long time, like environmental baseline studies and certain things. They take, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, they're time-based and situational. Whereas if you're looking to optimize a technical design, you can put more people on there and potentially make it go quicker. So I think that's a big part of speeding projects up. The other one is just, and again, is understanding what the next phases are. So an example is if you're doing cultural heritage surveys, which can take a long time to organise, and a lot of organisations and groups do target specific ones, so you have to go back multiple times. Whereas if you've done a bigger area, then you can understand where infrastructure can go and can't go. Now, that's defining where the cultural heritage is, but it's not providing consent to build the project. That comes from native title consent later on. Does that make sense? So understanding the constraints early is probably the easiest way to summarise that.
There is another one. Is how do you suggest that decision makers are best informed on closure challenges and costs when the NAV approach discounted away?
Yeah, really good question. So closure costs, are often thought of at the end, which is a really challenging piece, but it does, my experience is that's changing now because of the securitisation of closure bonds that are coming on earlier into balance sheets with what's going on. But fundamentally, it's about communicating to the business, easier said than done, what the impact is of doing these things. So if you can do progressive closure or design your project that you don't need those big landforms, and it brings down the cost over time and reduces the risk, then that can be traded off, inside the business around where that is. But yeah, it's a challenge because when projects are 20 or 30, 40, 50 years later and that cost is going to be there, it's not necessarily a consideration. Does that, yeah.
So that you have 2 years of waiting time after everything has been done. What usually happens there?
So that's a great question. So I don't. This is S&P Global's data, but I don't know is probably the first answer, because everything will be different in the company. But a couple of things that, off the top of my head is that at one end of the spectrum, they bring it all together, the company does, and they reconcile all the different work packages that are required to deliver the project and add it all up together, and it becomes a bit of a Frankenstein. They realise it's not going to work, so then you go into value optimization or send it back. There might be economic factors, considerations. So inside a business, you've got capital sequencing. So you might have multiple projects that are happening at the same time. So companies might choose to capitalize that project before that project. There might be things like currency or commodity prices that change, those sort of things. So, and often in these projects, there's a level of optimization that happens and value engineering you know, when everything's brought together, and that's normal and that's really important. And I suppose when you think about preconditions and considerations, is if you've got all the preconditions, you can optimize what you want because you have the consents and licenses to do that. It's when you want to optimize something that you're not permitted to do or doesn't conform with the overall project design that then it becomes problematic. So yeah, it'd be fascinating to get the source data out of that, but I don't think that's going to happen. So.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Shall we thank Geoff for presenting this morning?
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining online.
So that's all that we have for today. See you next week for the Friday JKMRC seminar. Thank you.